The Montana wind howled like a starving spirit outside the small log cabin. Each gust made the old timbers creak, a constant dialogue between the fragile human construction and the vast wilderness that surrounded it. Inside, Silas sat in his worn leather armchair, the only sound besides the wind being the soft crackle of the fire in the stone hearth and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the large wolf lying at his feet. Shadow, that was what he called him. A creature of dark, almost black fur, with piercing yellow eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. He was not a pet, but a companion, a living echo of a past that Silas worked daily to keep buried under layers of silence and routine. That night the routine was broken. While searching for an old pocket knife in a jammed drawer of a pine dresser, his fingers touched something they hadn't felt in over a decade, a small field notebook with a faded green canvas cover and worn edges. He pulled it out. The air seemed to grow thicker. The smell of old paper, dampness, and phantom gunpowder rose to his nostrils. He opened it with a reluctance that was almost physical. The pages were filled with his hurried, angular handwriting, patrol notes, terrain sketches, coded ciphers. But it was the last page that caught his attention. Scrawled with a pen that was nearly out of ink, a set of coordinates, latitude and longitude. No name, no explanation, just the numbers. He didn't need an explanation. Those numbers were etched into a part of his mind he kept locked away. They were the coordinates of a base that officially never existed. A blind spot on the map, a whisper in the corridors of power. A place where men like him went to disappear and do things that could not be spoken of. Why had he written them there? He couldn't remember. Perhaps a final act of defiance, a refusal to let the memory be completely erased. The fire cast dancing shadows on the wall, making the cabin feel smaller, more confined. He looked down at Shadow. The wolf lifted his head, his yellow eyes fixed on his. There was no question or confusion in the animal's gaze, only a silent understanding, a readiness that mirrored what was beginning to bubble up in Silas's own blood. He closed the notebook with a soft snap that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The decision was made, not with logic, but with a primal instinct, a call from the deep. In the morning they would leave. Dawn arrived like a cold blade, cutting through the darkness with a pale, gray light that offered no warmth. Snow had fallen during the night, covering the world in a pristine white blanket. Silas's pickup truck, a rusty relic from another era, protested when he turned the key, the engine coughing and sputtering before finally catching, the sound tearing through the stillness of the forest. Shadow leaped into the passenger seat, circled once, and settled down, his large body taking up almost the entire space. Silas put the truck in gear, and it began to crawl down the ill-defined track that led to the main road. The radio was off, broken for years. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the sound of the tires chewing through the fresh snow. The landscape was a study in white and gray, a monochromatic painting of snow-laden pines and a low, heavy sky. To anyone else, it would be just a lonely road. To Silas, every mile was a regression. He saw ghosts in the trees, faces of men who had marched beside him, their breaths condensing in the frigid air of a different winter, in a distant place. He remembered the weight of the rifle in his hands, the cold of the metal against his cheek. He remembered the silence before contact, a silence so profound you could hear your own blood pulsing in your ears. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had tried to bury all of it. He had come to Montana to find silence, to let the vastness of nature erase the confined memories of steel corridors and clandestine missions. But the past was like permafrost, frozen just beneath the surface, always present. Shadow shifted in his seat, letting out a soft sigh and nudging his snout against Silas's arm. Silas relaxed his grip on the wheel, his breath escaping in a cloud of vapor. The wolf was there. The wolf had always been there. He had been a pup back then, found trembling beside his dead mother during a reconnaissance patrol. Against all regulations, Silas had hidden him in his pack, fed him from his own rations. Shadow was the only living thing he had brought back from that place. The road became less of a road and more of a suggestion, an old scar on the land that nature was slowly healing. After several hours, he stopped the truck where the trail finally surrendered to the forest. The engine died with a final gasp, and the silence fell like a heavy blanket. It was a different silence from the one at the cabin. It was an ancient, expectant silence. He opened the door and the frigid air hit him, clearing his mind. He grabbed his pack from the back seat, checked his compass and GPS, though he knew the way by instinct. Shadow leaped out into the snow, his body tense, his ears erect. He started walking, the sound of his boots breaking the icy crust the only percussion in that still world. The forest was dense, the trees tall and silent as sentinels. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. It didn't take long to find the first traces. A rusted metal stake, almost completely covered by snow, with a piece of twisted barbed wire still attached to it. A little further on, another one. They were the remains of the outer perimeter, a warning to the uninitiated that they were entering forbidden territory. Silas stopped, crouching beside one of the stakes. He ran a gloved finger over the corroded metal. How many times had he patrolled this line, his eyes scanning the darkness, Shadow moving silently beside him? The wolf was now sniffing the ground, his nose twitching. He let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated in Silas's chest. He wasn't growling at a present threat, but at the memory of one. The wind cut his face, sharp as a blade. He stood up and continued on, following the nearly invisible line of the old perimeter. The silence of the forest was absolute. There were no bird songs, no sounds of small animals. It was as if life itself had learned to avoid this place. He saw footprints in the snow, but they weren't recent. They were old depressions, frozen into the ground beneath the fresh layer of snow. Footprints from military boots. The tread pattern still vaguely discernible. Ghosts frozen in time. He continued for nearly an hour, moving with the economy of motion of a man who had spent his life moving unseen. The forest began to thin slightly, and he knew he was close. And then he saw it. At first it was just a dark line against the white, a geometric anomaly in the organic disarray of the forest. As he got closer, the shape became clearer. A gate, a heavy metal gate, over 10 feet high, half buried in a drift of snow and earth. The olive-drab paint was peeling, revealing patches of rust that looked like dried blood. The bolts were as thick as a man's wrist, corroded and seized. Shadow stopped a few yards away, the fur on his back bristling. Silas approached slowly, as if approaching a tomb. He reached out and touched the ice-cold metal. The cold seemed to seep through his glove, travel up his arm, and settle in his heart. He brushed the snow from a metal plate attached to the gate. The letters were nearly gone, but he didn't need to read them. He knew them by heart. ARC-7, Arctic Research Base. 7. A deliberately misleading designation for a facility that had nothing to do with Arctic research. It was a black hole, a listening post and special operations hub strategically placed to watch over nothing and everything at the same time. Shadow's breath condensed in clouds of vapor in the frigid air, each exhalation a small ghost dissipating into the void. Silas gripped the cold bars of the gate, the weight of years of secrets and violence seeming to press down on him. He had to get in. He had to see. With a grunt of effort, he pushed. The gate didn't move. He pushed again, putting his full weight into it, his boots slipping in the snow. The metal groaned in protest, a long, high-pitched sound that echoed through the silent forest. And with that sound, the floodgates of his memory burst open. The shriek of metal mixed with other sounds in his mind. Voices crackling over the radio, urgent, full of static and fear. "Spectre, this is Echo 1. We have contact. Repeat, hostile contact on the northern perimeter." The voice was Leo's, his partner, a 20-year-old kid from Ohio, who could quote Shakespeare and assemble a sniper rifle in under 60 seconds. Silas saw his face, the easy smile, the eyes that hadn't yet seen enough to turn hard. He felt the recoil of his own rifle against his shoulder, the sound of shots muffled by the thick snow, the muzzle flashes tearing through the darkness of a perpetual night, the smell of cordite and pine, the metallic taste of adrenaline in his mouth. He was back there, the cold no longer Montana's, but the biting cold of a mission gone wrong, an ambush that should never have happened. He felt a pressure on his leg and blinked, the sight of the white forest snapping back into focus. Shadow was there, his big, furry head pressed firmly against his thigh, his yellow eyes looking up at him with unwavering intensity. The wolf always did that. On the longest patrols, in the darkest nights, when the tension became almost unbearable, Shadow would move close and offer that physical contact, an anchor point in the chaos. It was as if to say, "I am here. You are not alone." Silas took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. The avalanche of memories subsided, retreating to the dark corners of his mind. He ran a hand over Shadow's head, the thick fur warm beneath his fingers. "I know, boy. I know." He turned back to the gate. This time, he didn't try to push. He examined the hinges, the lock, searching for a weakness. He found what he was looking for. One of the pins on the lower hinge was corroded, the metal around it weakened by rust. He took a small pry bar from his pack. It took 20 minutes of hard, methodical work, the only sound the groaning of metal and his own ragged breathing. Finally, with a loud crack, the pin gave way. The gate sagged to one side, opening a narrow gap, just enough for a man and a wolf to slip through. The darkness on the other side was total, a void that seemed to swallow the light. A breath of stale air wafted out of the opening, air that hadn't seen the sun in years. It exhaled the smell of rust, dampness, and cold concrete. Silas switched on the flashlight mounted on his shoulder. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a concrete corridor that sloped down into the bowels of the earth. The walls were stained with moisture, and small icicles hung from the ceiling. Warning signs in military English, almost illegible under a layer of grime, marked the walls. Restricted area. Use of lethal force authorized. He stepped inside, and Shadow followed close behind, the wolf's claws making a soft scraping sound on the concrete floor. Each step echoed, amplified by the narrow corridor. The sound seemed to travel far into the darkness, as if announcing their arrival to an empty auditorium. The beam of his flashlight danced across the walls, illuminating steel doors with numbers and designations. Armory, B barracks, infirmary. All were closed, sealed by time and rust. Shadow moved with a stealthy grace, his nose constantly in the air, sniffing every corner, every shadow. His instincts, sharpened by a life in the wild and by training no other animal had received, were on high alert. Silas trusted the wolf's senses more than his own. He followed the main corridor as it continued to descend in a gentle spiral. He knew where he was going. There was one place he had to see, the heart of the base, the brain that controlled all its secret operations. He came to a set of double steel doors stenciled with Communications Center. One of the doors was slightly ajar. He pushed it. The door creaked loudly and swung open into a large room. The air in here was even thicker, with a strong smell of mildew, dust, and the ozone from dead electronics. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room. Metal consoles lined the walls, filled with old radios, oscilloscopes, and rows of switches and dials. Topographical maps, yellowed and brittle, were still pinned to corkboards, covered in notes and routes marked in red pen. Metal crates with special operations symbols were stacked in a corner, coated in a thick layer of dust. It was like entering a pyramid, a tomb dedicated to a cold, secret war. He approached one of the main consoles. His fingers, almost of their own accord, reached for a large red switch. It was the main power switch for the long-range radio system. It was madness. The base's main power should have been dead for years, the backup batteries long since drained. But he flipped the switch anyway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small green light flickered on the panel, faint and hesitant, and a sound filled the silent room. A hiss, static, a live noise. Silas froze. It was impossible. Unless the base wasn't completely dead. There was an emergency geothermal power source, he remembered. A system designed to last for decades, to maintain the most vital functions in case of abandonment. He leaned over the radio, his hand trembling slightly as he turned the frequency dial. The hiss changed pitch, rising and falling. He passed through bands of silence, through bursts of cosmic static. He was about to give up, to chalk the sound up to a random electrical fault, when he heard it, faint, almost swallowed by the hiss. A voice, distorted, broken, but undeniably a human voice, and it spoke a single word, his old call sign. Spectre. Silas's blood froze in his veins. The air seemed to be sucked from his lungs. He looked around the dark room, his heart hammering against his ribs. Shadow let out a low, deep growl, his yellow eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the doorway. It wasn't a recording. There was an inflection in the voice, a live, present quality. Someone, or something, was still broadcasting on this channel, an encrypted channel that only a handful of people had ever known. This was no ordinary enemy. It was someone who knew his past, someone who was tied to this place. Spectre, the voice repeated, a little clearer this time, as if the transmitter was gaining strength. You've returned. The voice was an electronic whisper, genderless, ageless. Silas swallowed hard. Silas. His throat suddenly dry. He reached for the microphone, his fingers hovering over the transmit button. To answer was a risk. It was to confirm his presence. But the silence was unbearable. He pressed the button. The hiss stopped. replaced by a charged silence. "Who is this?" His own voice sounded strange, hoarse from disuse in such a context. The reply didn't come immediately. The ensuing silence weighed on the room like a concrete slab. Each second stretched into an eternity. He could hear his own blood pulsing, the sound of shadows breathing. Then the radio crackled back to life, but not with a voice. It was a different sound, a series of clicks and beeps, Morse code, slow, deliberate. Silas closed his eyes, concentrating, translating the sounds in his mind as he had done so many times in the past. DOORLEO, ARCHIVESROOM. The transmission stopped. Leo. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Leo was dead. He had watched him fall that night of the ambush. What was this? A ghost in the machine? A trap? Driven by a desperate need to understand, he moved away from the radio. "Archives room," the message had said. He knew where it was. Down a side corridor, behind a reinforced door. He moved quickly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Shadow was at his side, a silent, lethal bodyguard. The door to the archives room was locked. He used the pry bar again, forcing the lock with a protesting shriek of metal. The room was small, cold, and lined with steel filing cabinets, drawer after drawer, all labeled with operation codes. He started pulling them open, one by one. The drawers were full of folders. He opened one. Mission reports, yellowed, typewritten papers, full of military jargon and information redacted with thick black bars. He flipped through the documents. These were operations that had never made the official records. Assassination missions, sabotage, destabilization. Missions erased from history. Names of men listed as missing in training or killed in accidents were here, detailed as casualties in combats that officially never happened. This place wasn't just a listening post. It was a grave for secrets. In the last drawer, in an unlabeled folder, he found it. It wasn't a report. It was a photograph, a Polaroid, the colors slightly faded with time. The photo showed two men in winter combat gear, standing in front of the same gate he had just passed through. One of the men was older, with a face he didn't recognize. The other, it was him, younger, his face leaner, his eyes hard but not yet carrying the weight they did now. And beside him, sitting in the snow, was a dark-furred wolf pup with disproportionately large ears. Shadow. The photo had been taken at this very base. He looked at the adult wolf beside him, then back at the pup in the image. The circle was complete. He looked back at the other man in the photo. There was something familiar about his eyes. He turned the photo over. Something was written on the back, in the same handwriting as the notebook. Spectre and Leo. Last patrol. ARC-7. Leo. The man in the photo was Leo. But the voice on the radio, the Morse code, he didn't understand. He put the photo in his pocket and continued to search the folder. At the bottom was one last document, a psychiatric report. The name at the top was Leo's. The date was 2 days before the ambush. The report described symptoms of acute combat stress, paranoia, auditory hallucinations. The doctor recommended Leo's immediate removal from active duty. The recommendation had been denied. Signed by the base commander. He felt a wave of nausea. They knew Leo was on the edge, and they sent him out to die anyway. The voice on the radio? It wasn't Leo. It was a recording, a looping recording perhaps, triggered by a motion sensor, broadcasting Leo's last desperate message to an archive, a final warning that no one ever heard. Door. Leo. Archives room. He was trying to tell someone, trying to leave a record. Silas sank to the floor, his back against a cold steel filing cabinet. The weight of it all crushed him. The truth wasn't an enemy he could fight, a threat he could eliminate. It was a poison spreading slowly through his veins. He understood then. This place had never been just a military post. It was where his soul had fractured, where he learned that the lines between right and wrong were blurred, and that the monsters weren't always on the other side of the rifle sight. He had come here following the coordinates in a forgotten notebook, thinking he was searching for something, but he wasn't searching. He was being summoned, called back to the site of his own fall, to finally face the ghosts he had tried to leave behind. Shadow came over and lay down beside him, his warm body a comfort against his. The wolf rested his head on his knee, letting out a deep sigh as if he too felt the weight of this return, as if an old cycle was finally closing. Outside, the wind howled louder. A storm was rolling in. He heard a long, high-pitched sound from the corridor, The same sound he'd heard before, the groaning of metal. The wind, funneled through the entrance, was pushing the rusted gate. Slowly, inexorably, the gate was closing behind them, sealing the entrance, plunging the subterranean world back into its ancient darkness and silence. But for Silas, for the first time in many years, the silence no longer felt empty. It was full of truths, and in the darkness of the forgotten base, under the weight of the Montana snow, he finally stopped running.